Hi, everybody. It is week 15, our last week of the semester, and that means it is our final week of practicing Stoicism as well. We are finally to the end of Epictetus's Handbook. Today we're going to be talking about remarks 52 and 53, the last two, and we'll begin with 52. Let's see what he says. In 52, he distinguishes what he calls three areas of philosophy. Um, the first, he says, which he calls the most necessary area, is the application of principles such as, and he gives the example, not to lie. So you can have a moral principle, don't lie, and applying that principle, he says, is the first area. The second area, which I might call normative ethics, is an area, he says, that treats the proofs and the grounds for the principles that one should not lie, or whatever the moral principles may be. So there's the kind of application of those principles in your life, which are going to lead to certain actions. There's the part of philosophy that's a little more theoretical that might involve thinking about what those principles are and what justifies them. And then there's a third area, he says, which philosophers sometimes call metaethics or possibly philosophy of logic, where you're going to look more at the actual proofs themselves, proofs of those principles, and analyze the proofs. Think about what a proof is, he says. Think about what validity is, what contradiction is, what truth and falsehood are. So those are additional questions that philosophers think about. And one thing to note about this section is this is different from the three areas that we have seen Epictetus investigating in the handbook. Remember, he talks about thinking about the things that we are that we desire, right, and that we're averse to, and that's one part of sort of applied ethics, if you like. And remember, a second part had to do with fulfilling our various ethical and moral roles, and thinking about what are the appropriate actions as a part of those roles. And the third part was what he calls the third discipline, involves making sure that all of our, that, that we're not carried away by impressions, right? That we've sort of shaped our mind so that we don't assent to the wrong impressions, so that we're sort of, in a way, able to back up the other two disciplines. And so those are all, I would say, those three disciplines that we see being investigated in the handbook probably fall under this first area that here he's talking about, which is, and it all has to do with how our different moral principles are applied in how we live our lives. But he's noting that there are these other areas in philosophy as well, and he says there's an order of importance, right? He says we only need the third area as a way of kind of backing up or supporting the second area, and the second we need because of the first. And he says the first is the most necessary, right? It's the one that where we ought to stay, as he puts it. It's the most important. Okay, and we know that. We know that throughout the whole handbook, he has been stressing how to really become a philosopher, to learn these things, to become wiser about these things. The best test of that and the best way of showing that is through your life, how you act. And what he says, though, is goes on often is the opposite of what should go on. He says, we often do the opposite. We spend our time on the third area here he's talking about, like the most abstract, right? The logical questions, thinking about very theoretically how to explain and prove these things. And that's not to say that that is an important part of philosophy, but what he's saying is people often become really enthusiastic about that. And in the process, they neglect the first part, which, they sort of lose track of what's most important. It's not that different from the earlier passage we talked about last week, where, remember, he said somebody might go seek the writings of Chrysippus because they had heard that he was somebody who could help them understand what it is to follow nature. And then when they didn't understand the writings of Chrysippus, they might find somebody else who could help them interpret the writings of Chrysippus. Those are all good things to do, and and people can do that better and worse. But we shouldn't lose sight of our real ultimate goal, which is following nature. And he says sometimes people just get so into interpreting the writings of Chrysippus and arguing about that they sort of lose track of that overall more important philosophical purpose and become, in effect, literary critics and scholars. Same thing here. I think you could say that Epictetus is closing with a kind of danger, which is that philosophy itself, especially in the theoretical sides of it, can become a kind of temptation. It can become something that we get enthusiastic about. And Epictetus is fine with that because he's also enthusiastic about these things. But it's not good if it interferes with us keeping in mind, well, what this is all about, right? Which is living well. So just as earlier, Epictetus had said, hey, be careful about calling yourself a philosopher openly to others, people who might not understand that or respect that. Or if you are still internalizing the principles and you're working on making those things play a role in your life, then you need to be careful, he said. So it's better maybe even not to call yourself a philosopher or even a philosophy student. Just sort of try to do as best you can to work on these things and let them be expressed in your life. Well, here he's identifying maybe a second danger when it comes to philosophy, which is be wary of the theoretical and how that too can be something that can be kind of intoxicating and cool, right? It can really engage you, but it's a tool. It's a set of tools that should be appreciated and mastered maybe, but also realize, okay, we only need these things because we're trying to apply moral principles in our life, okay? And what happens, he says, because we end up neglecting the first, which is the most important area of philosophy, which, you know, when it comes to ethics is really what the whole handbook is about. Because we neglect that, he says, we end up being somebody who, we end up being people who tell lies, right? Even though we're ready to advance the proofs for why we shouldn't. And that's not a great outcome, okay? All right, the second, our final remark 53, is interesting because it ends with 4 quotations. And he says that these are quotations that we should have on hand on every occasion. So wherever we are in life, when we face something, and maybe especially you might think, things sometimes are going to get difficult, right? Things might throw us. They might stun us. They might make it hard for us to keep our eyes on track. And these quotations, he thinks, are things that will help guide us, right? The first is a famous quotation that is attributed to Cleanthes, one of the early founders of Stoicism. And it's something that Epictetus frequently quotes parts of throughout his discourses. And notice it's sort of speaking to Zeus as well as to destiny. Lead me, Zeus and destiny, wherever you have ordained for me. So there is a kind of recognition of the gods and the idea that your life in some sense has been planned by them, right? They've laid it out. And you're saying you will follow unflinchingly. That's the commitment that you're making. That's what, and if you could remember this quotation, you'll remember maybe when it's hard, hey, I already said I would go wherever it is the gods thought I should. And it also acknowledges that sometimes people try to resist fate and resist what has been ordained for them, right? But noting that even if you do, you will follow, right? This is something we can tie to another famous image of Stoicism, that it's the image of a cart, a horse-drawn cart moving along, and a dog that is attached to that cart by a leash. And the dog needs to run along either behind or on the side of this cart. the cart goes forward, and the dog will also follow wherever the cart goes. It has a certain amount of freedom. It can run about. It can investigate things. It can maybe track a certain scent, but it needs to go where the cart goes. And if it stops running, if it resists in some sort of way, it will be dragged. So that's another image that the Stoics sometimes use for sort of trying to capture this sense in which we have a fate or a destiny, the way that the world is set up. There are all sorts of things that happen to us, and they are outside of our control. But what we do have control of, and the ways in which we have a certain kind of freedom, you might say, is a freedom from certain things, right? We've seen that the Stoics have tried to show us how we might gain a kind of freedom from fear, right? Or from distress, or from certain other passions or troubles, right? More generally, while we still nevertheless follow along. And this is something that if you have the right attitude, Epictetus thinks, then you'll sort of see that as something that has been sent by the gods. The second quotation is from Euripides, an ancient Greek playwright who wrote tragedies. And I think it's related to some of the thoughts from the first. He says, whosoever complies nobly with necessity, we count as wise and knowing things divine, right? So there's this idea that obviously necessity's there, right? And you can either, you have to comply, right? So it's not a question of whether you comply or not, it's how you comply, right? You can comply nobly, or you can sort of refuse your fate. You can resist. You cannot carry on in a way where you sort of recognize the gods and their wisdom. The dog that sort of runs along freely and happily behind the cart, that's the person who complies nobly, who may be counted as wise, and sort of appreciating the divine role that the gods play, like the role of the divine in our lives. Then we finish with two quotations from our hero, Socrates, right? These are not literal, but they're close paraphrases of things that Socrates says, in the one case to his friend Crito, in the dialogue to Crito, which we have in our Trial and Death of Socrates book, but we did not read or discuss. I would highly recommend you read it. It's wonderful. And then the second from the Apology, right? So the first that he says to Crito is, if it, and the translator has put in from the context, my death is pleasing to the gods, so let it be, right? So even death is something that may be asked of us, right? And if that's a part, it will be asked of all of us at some point. And when it is, you can respond nobly or you can respond badly, right? And the example of Socrates maybe is something that can help us and encourage us to sort of, we know, remember from the end of remark 51 that Epictetus leaves us with this image for sort of how to think about what it is to be a philosopher, what it is to be a philosophy student. And he says you should hold before your eye the idea of Socrates, right? He says, even though you are not yet Socrates, you ought to live as somebody who wants to be a Socrates. Okay, so similarly here, when your death comes along and you're finding it hard, perhaps, remind yourself how Socrates approached his death. And then last but not least is our final remark, which is from the Apology. And Socrates basically reaffirming the Stoic view that other people can't harm us. They can do things to us, including kill us, but they can't harm us from the Stoic and Socratic point of view, right? The only ones who can harm us are ourselves. So these four quotations, you know, learning them, memorizing them, having them ready at hand should help us if things get difficult, right? Um, and there's sort of three things that maybe we can stress. One is the gods, right, are appealed to as the source of what happens to us, right? So keeping that in mind can be helpful. The second is that those who are wise, or the ones who love wisdom the most, the advanced philosophy students, the philosophers, like Socrates, are the ones that follow the gods. They're like the dog that runs along happily behind the cart, right? They don't flinch. They do it nobly, right? Even if it's their death that comes along, right? When it comes, they handle themselves well. They know how to die well as how to live well. Uh, and finally, that there are going to be occasions as you are going about your life, right? The gods will ordain things, things will happen to you. Sometimes they'll test you, and that's going to include other people, right? Sometimes trying to harm us, right? And in it, not only should we recognize the authority of the gods and keep in mind that they are determining the overall outcome and the way that things are unfolding. But we should keep in mind that others can't harm us, right? That at bottom, only we can harm ourselves. And if we can keep these thoughts in our mind, then Epictetus thinks we're pretty well equipped for going about our lives and for living reasonably well. Okay, that is it. We've come to the end of the handbook. I hope you continue to read it. I hope you maybe work on some of the ideas expressed in it. Maybe you'll find that you too will become a little bit of a kind of Stoic or a Socratic. I like to think of myself as both. Okay, thanks. See you guys, I don't know when.